The chains had always been cold. That was the first thing she remembered, before memory became a word, before she understood anything, except the weight of silver wrapped around her wrists and ankles. 22 years. She didn't know it had been 22 years until much later, because time moved differently when you lived in a labor house with other chained women. When days blurred into the same gray stone walls, the same copper-tasting water, the same orders barked in voices that never softened. The labor house woke before dawn. The bells rang with a sound like iron screaming, a noise that cut straight through sleep and into the bones of every woman housed there. She woke where she always woke, on the cold stone floor in the corner of the sleeping quarters, her corner, the space no one else claimed because it belonged to the defective. The chains caught as she moved, their weight distributed across her body like a lever made of metal and cruelty. Both wrists, both ankles, a belt of silver around her narrow waist, a thin collar that had rubbed her neck raw so many times the wound had become permanent scar tissue. 7 locks total, each one sealed with something that felt like fire whenever her skin touched the metal. She learned her handler's footsteps before she learned language, the heavy tread of the man with the slicked back blonde hair, the one who held the keys to the chains, who pulled her out of the sleeping corner by the metal links when the sun was barely up. His name was Verd, though she'd never called him anything to his face. She'd learned early that speaking without permission meant the chains tightened, which shouldn't have been physically possible, but somehow was. His boots were wet from morning dew, and they left dark prints on the stone floor. He moved through the dormitory with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never questioned their right to exist in any space. Breakfast came in wooden bowls, thin gruel that tasted like the water it was boiled in, with the occasional grain of something that might have been oat or might have been sawdust. She never knew which. The bowls were set on the long wooden tables, and the women were expected to eat quickly and standing, never sitting, never lingering over a meal as if it might provide comfort or sustenance. Leora had learned to eat without tasting, to consume the gruel as fuel rather than nourishment. The other women avoided her. They'd been trained to avoid her. She was defective, wolfless, the one born wrong. Their whispers followed her through the labor house like a persistent cold. The healers examined her as an infant and found nothing. No spark of the wolf. She's less than human. Lucky they keep her alive at all. The inspection came every morning after breakfast. Vard would walk down the line of chained women, and when he reached her, he would yank hard on the chains, checking that they were tight, that they hadn't somehow loosened overnight to give her hope of escape. Her wrists bore permanent crescents of scarring, silver-white marks that never quite healed because the wounds never closed. The ankles were worse. The metal had rubbed through her skin so many times that the flesh beneath was more scar tissue than skin. She'd learned not to fidget, not to test the weight anymore. Instead, she made herself small. She ate standing. She slept in corners. She moved through the labor house at angles that accommodated the chains, sideways through doorways, careful on stairs, always aware of the weight pulling at her bones. Days passed in the labor house like water through a sieve. She cleaned, she scrubbed, she hauled water from the well until her shoulders screamed. She sorted grain and mended clothes with fingers that barely bent anymore. The work was endless and the same. It was a rhythm without purpose, motion without meaning. The other women moved around her as if she weren't there. A few were kind in small ways. A sip of extra water left where her chains wouldn't catch, a shared scrap of something soft on a day when her wrists bled worse than usual. But mostly they ignored her. They'd learned to ignore her. The defective wasn't real to them, and she'd learned that if she tried hard enough, she could convince herself she wasn't real either. When the announcement came, servants exchanged between the great packs to maintain alliance bonds. She was sorted into the shipment without ceremony. A handler appeared with a manifest written on parchment, and her name, or the word used to identify her, was marked with an X. Vard collected her that morning with his usual yanking aggression, and she was loaded into a covered wagon, along with 3 other servants and 2 guards who made it clear through their complete indifference that her value was less than cargo. The wagon journey to Thornvale Citadel lasted 7 days, and every moment was torture in ways she hadn't known were possible. The covered wagon had no windows, just slats of wood with gaps that let in fractured light and the sounds of the world outside. The road was nothing but bumps and ruts, and every impact sent pain shooting through her ankles where the chains bit deepest. The sound of the chains clinked constantly, a metallic song that seemed to mark her passage as clearly as if she'd been announced by a herald. Around her, the 3 other servants tried to disappear into themselves the way she'd learned to do. The guards paid them no attention. Vered rode at the front of the wagon, and occasionally she heard him laughing with the guards, deep sounds that made something in her chest tighten into a fist. She didn't understand why. She only knew that his laugh meant whatever came next, she would need to be smaller than she already was. On the 3rd day, the wagon crested a ridge, and through a gap in the slats, she caught her first glimpse of Thornvale Citadel. The walls rose like teeth against a gray sky. Massive blocks of stone fitted so perfectly that no mortar was visible. The fortress seemed to climb directly out of the mountain, as if it had grown there rather than been built. Pennants snapped from the towers in colors she'd never seen before. The wind carried a scent that made the back of her neck prickle, something wild, something that smelled like mountains and magic and the untamed north. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. Something in her wanted to lean toward that scent the way a plant leans toward sunlight. She suppressed the instinct. Wanting things was dangerous. Thornvale Citadel was even more massive up close. The courtyard seemed to stretch forever. Stone swept clean, the surface so smooth it must have been worked for weeks. Guards in armor that caught the light lined the walls. Servants moved in organized patterns, carrying supplies and managing the complex logistics of a fortress that housed hundreds. The other servants were assigned to various houses, and their guards claimed them like luggage. She was taken directly to the main kitchens, a cavernous space with an enormous hearth at one end, massive tables for preparation, and shelves that climbed to the high ceilings. The head cook was a woman named Mara, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with eyes that had seen everything and judged most of it. She gave Leora a broom and a list of rooms to clean, then added quietly, "Keep your head down and your mouth shut. The Citadel doesn't care about the defective, but showing curiosity can change that." Leora nodded, understanding immediately that this kindness was the most she could expect. The first week passed without incident. She cleaned, She fetched water from the kitchen cistern, filling buckets until the cold seeped into her bones. She scrubbed pots until her hands were raw and bleeding. She worked in steady, practiced silence. No one paid her special attention. The Citadel staff moved around her as if she were part of the architecture. Present, necessary, invisible. The chains caught on door frames and stairs, and she became expert at anticipating where they would snag, moving her body at angles that accommodated the silver weight. The scars on her wrists burned less constantly after those first few days. She had started to understand this place, its rhythms, the morning rush when the kitchens prepared food for the guards, changing of watches, the quiet hours in the afternoon, the evening meal when the entire fortress seemed to exhale. She found safe corners, small places where the shadows were deep enough to hide in. Then the Alpha King noticed her, and everything became sharp again. She didn't see it happen at first. It was the way the servants around her suddenly became very interested in appearing smaller, in giving her space as if proximity to her defectiveness might be contagious. It was the quality of silence that fell when he entered the kitchen, different from the silence she usually lived in. This silence had weight. This silence had eyes. She kept her gaze on the turnips she was chopping, the knife moving in practice patterns. The blade was dull from the number of times it had been used, and it required her full attention to cut through the vegetable flesh. That was what she told herself, why she didn't look up. Not because she was afraid, not because something in her chest had suddenly tightened into a fist. He was tall. That was what she could see from the corner of her vision. Tall enough that he occupied space the way a storm occupies the sky. Black hair falling past his shoulders in a way that suggested power and wildness both. Black leather armor vest over a dark gray tunic, each piece fitted to his muscular frame. Silver buckles caught the kitchen light. His boots had been polished so clean they reflected the kitchen lanterns like dark mirrors. His presence seemed to make the air itself sharper, colder, more aware of itself. She heard him ask questions in a voice that was very quiet and therefore more frightening than any shouting could be. The voice of someone who never had to raise his tone because everyone listened so intently. The head cook answered in the nervous stammer of someone being examined, someone about to be judged. When he left the kitchen, she released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. But he returned, and returned again, always at different times, as if he were mapping the kitchen's rhythms, understanding the patterns, like a wolf, learning the territory it would claim. He didn't speak to her directly. He watched. She could feel his eyes on her, the way you can feel the moment a predator decides whether you're prey or something more interesting than prey. He watched her hands, careful and practiced, the way she gripped the knife to avoid putting weight on her wrists. He watched her move around the kitchen, the way the chains dictated her movements, forcing her into those weird sideways angles when she had to reach high shelves. He watched her eat quickly, standing, eyes down, never lingering, never sitting as if she had earned the right to rest. He watched the way she flinched if anyone moved suddenly toward her, the involuntary response of a body trained to expect pain. One morning, the head cook told her to bring wine to the Alpha's private study. Her stomach did something complicated. The halls of Thornvale Citadel were different when she walked them without the other servants buffering her presence. The tapestries on the walls seemed to watch her pass. Her chains sounded impossibly loud, announcing her approach like a herald she hadn't chosen. When she reached the study door, she raised one hand to knock, and the chains caught on her sleeve, freezing her mid-motion. She was trapped in an awkward pose, held by her own restraints. The door opened before she could knock. He stood in the frame, and up close, his eyes were a gray that wasn't quite human. They seemed to glow with an inner amber light that made her think of something ancient and wild. "Come in," he said. Not a request. She entered. The study smelled like leather and old paper and something wild that she couldn't name. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. There was a fireplace, and the flames made shadows dance across his face, reshaping it moment to moment. He was studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle in a way she couldn't explain. A response that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, some part that had never been properly named. "I'm curious," he said quietly, and the words sounded like a threat and a promise braided together. "About those." His gaze fixed on her wrists, on the chains. "How old are you?" 22, she whispered. "And how long have you worn them?" The question seemed to come from another language. "How long?" "Always," she said. "Since birth." Something shifted in his face. His jaw tightened. She watched his hands clench into fists, then open, then clench again, as if he was fighting some instinct, something that wanted to break free from inside him. "Your handler," he said. "The one who came with you. Where is he?" "In the lower quarters. They assigned him." "Alone?" "Yes, but he—" The Alpha King moved past her, toward the door, with a predatory grace that made every cell in her body scream to run. But she stood frozen, holding the wine bottle, unable to move. When he reached the doorway, he paused. "Go to the healing wing. Ask for the healer. Don't speak to anyone else. Do you understand?" She nodded, not understanding at all. The encounter in the study had disturbed something. For 2 days, the handler was nowhere to be found. Then he reappeared, limping, his face bruised into colors that suggested violence had been done to him. He collected her that evening, his movements jerky and angry, and dragged her to a storage room beneath the citadel. The underground space was cold and damp, and it smelled like earth and things that rotted slowly. "Listen to me," he hissed, his fingers digging into her arm, hard enough to leave marks. "The king is curious about you, but his curiosity will pass. You are nothing. You are defective. You will answer his questions with the story. You are wolfless. You were born wrong. The chains are for everyone's protection. If you speak one word of the truth, I will personally ensure that you suffer in ways you can't imagine. Do you understand?" She understood. She had learned to understand a very long time ago. But the Alpha King's curiosity didn't pass. He summoned the healer himself. A guard escorted her, not Verd, someone else, someone who was merely indifferent rather than cruel. She found herself in the healing wing, a place of white stone and windows and light so different from the labor house that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. The stone here was polished smooth. The windows overlooked mountains that touched the sky. The air itself seemed cleaner, filled with the scent of herbs and something medicinal that burned gently at the back of her throat. She was placed on a table, an actual table, clean and covered with white linen, not a slab of stone. The healer was old, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that seemed to contain galaxies. She approached Leora slowly, as if afraid of her, and that alone was so different from every experience she'd ever had that it made her skin prickle. The healer examined the chains with a slowness that felt sacred, as if she were reading a text written in suffering. The healer's hands trembled. Her name, she said quietly, was Esma. What are these? Esma whispered, running her fingers over the locks without touching them, as if the metal itself might bite. Restraints, Leora said quietly, for the defective. The healer looked at the Alpha King, who was standing in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Something passed between them, a conversation with no words. The healer's face hardened. These are not restraints, she said. These are suppression chains, ancient blood-bonded chains. They haven't been used in 400 years because we made them illegal. We outlawed them because we discovered what they did. The healer's voice shook with what sounded like rage. They're designed to imprison a wolf inside its own body, to keep the beast from ever emerging, to make it so the human and the wolf are separated by silver and magic, forever screaming at each other from opposite sides of a wall. The words didn't make sense. She didn't have a wolf. That's what everyone had always told her. The handlers, the workers, the physicians who'd examined her as an infant and declared her defective. She was less than. She was broken. How long? The Alpha King asked. By the scarring, 20 years at minimum. Since infancy, probably. The healer looked down at her, and her expression was something Leora had never seen directed at her before. Something that combined rage and grief and compassion. Child, there's a wolf inside you. There always has been. For 22 years, it's been locked away, screaming. Not aloud, but internally. Every instinct you should have had has been suppressed. Every natural shift your body should have made has been arrested. Your very nature has been imprisoned. This is not just cruelty. This is dark magic. This is evil. She wanted to tell the healer that she was wrong, but something inside her was responding to the words, something deep beneath her skin that she'd never had a name for, a sensation of pushing against walls from the inside, a pressure that had lived with her so long. She'd assumed it was simply what it meant to be alive. The weight she carried wasn't just the chains. It was the weight of her own nature, held down by silver and sorcery. Remove them, the Alpha King said. I can't. The healer shook her head slowly. Not without the keys. These locks are sealed with blood magic. Whoever locked them in the first place bound them with their own essence, their own life force. The chains are part of them now, and they're part of whoever wears them. Only an alpha can break them now. Only someone with blood magic powerful enough to override the original binding. And it would require. The healer paused, studying the king's expression. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Your blood is strong enough. Your wolf is strong enough. But the pain, for her. Remove them, he repeated. What happened next lived in a space between pain and transformation that she would never quite be able to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. The Alpha King, Kale, she would learn to call him, approached her with his sleeves rolled up his muscled forearms. He examined each lock with methodical precision, running his fingers over the blood magic runes etched into the silver. Then he took a knife from the healer's instruments. It was sharp, too sharp, the kind of blade that could cut through anything. He placed the tip against his own left palm and looked her in the eyes. This will hurt, he said, not unkindly, but honest, a warning and a promise. Then he pressed the blade down and dragged it across his palm. Blood welled up, bright red, almost alive with an inner glow that intensified to golden amber as he held his hand over the first lock. What came next was agony, not from any external force, but from inside her own body. The chains had held her together, had been the container that kept herself intact. As the first lock began to dissolve under the Alpha King's blood magic, something shattered. She felt the wolf within her, actual, real, alive, more real than anything she'd ever felt, surge forward like a creature breaking through ice. It had been imprisoned so completely for so long, and now it tasted freedom and demanded everything. The rushing sensation of its presence filled her completely, filled every cell, burst through every barrier she'd built inside herself. She heard herself scream, a sound that came from her throat, but didn't feel like it belonged to her. It belonged to the wolf. It was the wolf's voice, finally being heard. "The first one is gone," the healer said quietly, her voice soft with wonder and horror mixed together. 6 more remain. The Alpha King was already bleeding, fresh, making a new cut across his palm. His hand came back, and with it came more agony as the second lock came undone. The wolf inside her was thrashing now, desperate, having tasted freedom and finding that freedom was incomplete. She wept. She'd never wept before. The chains had stolen even tears from her, apparently. Now they came freely, tears of pain and rage, and something that felt almost like joy. Lock 3. The pain had become something almost transcendent now, a full body experience of her own nature reasserting itself. She could feel the wolf's fur beneath her skin, sharp and real, could feel its teeth, its claws, muscles that had never been allowed to exist. She could feel strength rising from places inside her that had been sealed away. Her human consciousness was fragmenting slightly, pieces of her awareness blending with the wolf's awareness, and the sensation was both terrifying and transcendent. Lock 4. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, her human form straining under the weight of the transformation, trying to happen before it was ready. The Alpha King's hand was bleeding so heavily that the healer tried to intervene, tried to hand him cloth and bandages, tried to convince him to stop before he damaged himself beyond repair. But he waved her away with fierce determination, his voice a growl that was more wolf than human. "I will finish this," he said. His eyes had changed completely now. They glowed amber gold with an intensity that made the air around him seem to heat. The amber brightened and intensified with each lock he broke, as if each lock he destroyed fed his own power, as if his wolf was becoming more real, more present, more undeniable with every moment. His own wolf was rising to meet hers across the space between them. Recognition, power calling to power. She could feel it in her bones, in her blood, in the core of her being, the way 2 wolves recognize each other across a crowded space, across years of separation, across every barrier of magic and metal. His wolf saw her wolf, and in that seeing, both became undeniable. Lock 5. She could barely see anymore. The healing wing was spinning, or perhaps her consciousness was spinning, caught between the worlds of human and wolf. The wolf was so close to the surface now that she could taste its wildness, could feel its strength, could feel something awakening inside her that had been sleeping for 22 years. Every breath was becoming a gasp. Every heartbeat seemed to light her blood on fire. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, her lungs trying to expand against the silver restraint that had held them compressed for 22 years. The room smelled, she was smelling now, with something other than human senses, of blood and magic and stone, and the healer's fierce sweat, sharp and metallic and alive. When the fifth lock shattered, it made a sound like a temple bell struck at midnight, a pure tone that resonated through her bones and made her teeth ache. Her breathing changed immediately, became deeper, became the breathing of something larger, something with more capacity, something that had been forced to take shallow breaths for too long. Lock 6. The Alpha King's arm was wrapped with cloth now, a white bandage that turned red as the bleeding continued. The healer stood ready with more supplies, with water and clean linen, but he didn't stop. His jaw was clenched with the effort of channeling so much magic through his own body. The sixth lock gave way with a sound like breaking glass, actual glass, a pure crystalline shattering that seemed to echo through the entire citadel. A new kind of agony flooded through her, not pain anymore, but the sensation of her own body remembering itself, muscle memory awakening from a decades-long sleep, instinct resurging like a tide that had been held back by dams of magic, the wolf's fury and joy and desperate hunger all at once, a storm of feeling that nearly destroyed her. Her vision fractured into multiple colors at once. She could see in infrared and ultraviolet simultaneously. She could hear the heartbeat of every person in the citadel. She could smell the scent of a deer 3 miles away on the wind. The healer gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. A guard standing by the door stepped backward, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon, confused by the power radiating from the woman on the table. She could see the fear in their eyes. She could smell it in the air, hot and sharp, like copper pennies burning on heated stone. Sweat ran down her own face in rivers, soaking her hair, dripping from her chin. Her entire body was trembling now, shaking with the effort of containing the transformation that wanted to happen, the wolf that wanted to break free before all the chains were gone. The Alpha King reached out and steadied her with his free hand, his touch grounding her, keeping her tethered to this moment, even as she felt herself beginning to dissolve. Lock 7, the final lock, the one that had been wrapped around her waist, the thickest of all the chains, the one that had prevented her from breathing freely for 2 decades, that had kept her lungs partially collapsed, her body held in an eternal posture of suppression. The Alpha King didn't hesitate. He cut his palm again, deeper this time, the blade sinking into flesh, with determination born of necessity. Blood poured freely, so much blood that she worried he would bleed out before the lock gave way. But his wolf was with him, supporting him, sharing its strength. She could feel the bond forming between them, thin and new, but real. When he pressed his hand against the final silver lock, something happened that made the entire citadel shudder. The stone walls beneath her trembled. Cracks appeared in the white stone of the healing wing, spreading outward in patterns that looked almost like lightning. The healer fell to her knees, overwhelmed. The light itself seemed to bend, to twist, to fold in on itself as ancient magic met ancient magic, as suppression magic collided with the raw power of an alpha's blood and will. The final lock made a sound unlike the others, not the ringing of a bell or the shattering of glass, but something that sounded almost like a scream, a sound of agony and release combined. The scream of magic that had been bound too long finally breaking free. The metal turned molten for an instant before dissolving completely, the last of the suppression falling away. The final lock dissolved. The chains fell away, hitting the stone floor with the sound of freed bells ringing out their joy. All 7 locks scattered like offerings, like prayers answered, like the world finally correcting itself. For a moment, she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She was at a crossroads between her human self and the wolf she'd never been allowed to be. And for the first time in her life, neither one was winning. They were equal. They were both here. They were both real. They were not separate anymore. And then her body made a choice. The shift came like a storm, like the world turning inside out, like every cell in her body suddenly waking up after the longest sleep. Her form rippled, bones restructuring with a sound like thunder, skin becoming fur, humanity folding into something wilder and stronger. She felt herself expanding, felt her senses multiplying geometrically, felt the world come alive in colors and smells and sounds that made her human mind reel with the overwhelming intensity. The transformation was painful and beautiful, agony and ecstasy braided together so tightly that she couldn't separate them. Her bones lengthened and thickened, growing stronger with each heartbeat. Her muscles grew deeper, more real than they'd ever been in human form. Her spine curved and shifted, elongated, perfected for the form she was becoming. Her senses exploded outward like fireworks, and suddenly she could smell fear and joy, and the healer's amazement, and something else. The Alpha King's scent, wild and strong, and calling to her on a level that had no words. She could hear sounds that had no names in human language. The whisper of stone settling, the hum of magic in the air, the distant sound of wolves howling in the mountains, answering her call across impossible distances. She could taste the magic in the air itself, sharp and bright on her tongue. Her skin rippled as the transformation completed, as the last of her human form melted away. The wolf that emerged was silver, not pale silver, not a hint of silver in dark fur. Pure silver, like moonlight made flesh, like starlight given form, like the very metal of the chains that had held her for so long had been transformed into something alive and conscious and powerful. Her fur was so bright it seemed to illuminate the healing wing from within. Her fur caught the healing wing's light and seemed to glow from within with an inner luminescence that had no source, as if light emanated from her very being. Her eyes, the same bright green with gold flecks, blazed with power and intelligence and fury and joy all mixed together. She was larger than any female wolf on record, larger than most males, 600 pounds of muscle and magic and fury and something wild that had no name, something that the ancient texts had called silver fire. Her fur rippled when she moved, each hair catching light independently, creating the impression that she was made of liquid silver, that she could flow like water. Her paws were the size of human hands. Her teeth were like daggers. Her claws could carve through stone. When she howled, the entire citadel heard it. The sound was so pure, so clear, so filled with power and magic and 22 years of suppressed voice that it seemed to split the very sky open. Windows rattled in their frames. Some cracked, others shattered completely, sending cascades of glass down onto the stones below. The heavy wooden doors of the healing wing slammed open as if pushed by an invisible hand. stones groaned, the very foundations of the citadel resonating with the frequency of her voice. The sound carried up and out and across Thornvale and beyond, like a bell striking at the heart of the world, a sound that could be heard for 20 miles in every direction. It was a howl of pain, of rage, of triumph, of heartbreak, of freedom. It was every voice she'd been forced to silence, every scream she'd had to swallow, every cry of her wolf that she'd had to suppress for 2 decades. It was 22 years of screaming finally let loose, finally given form, finally allowed to exist. It was her wolf's voice, her true voice, being heard for the first time in a lifetime. It was the sound of a prophecy asserting itself, of destiny refusing to be denied, of power that could not be contained, announcing itself to the world. The Alpha King didn't move. His eyes were glowing brilliant amber, his own wolf howling back in response, a sound that matched hers, like an echo, like a mirror, like recognition across an impossible distance. For a moment, human and wolf, alpha and silver, locked eyes across the healing wing. It was recognition. It was equals finding each other at the end of very long journeys. It was 2 prophesied souls understanding their place in each other's future. She was a wolf, finally, completely, undeniably a wolf. The sensation was overwhelming, exhilarating, terrifying in its newness. Her paws connected with the stone floor, and she felt it, the ground beneath her, solid and real and utterly different from the sensation of stone under human feet. The air rushed through her fur, cool and charged with electricity. She could smell everything, the scent of blood, the Alpha King's blood, spilled for her, written in the air like a prayer. The scent of fear from the healer and the guards, sharp and metallic. The scent of the stone itself, old and ancient and layered with centuries of magic. Beyond the walls of the healing wing, she could smell the entire citadel, hundreds of people, each one with their own unique scent signature, their own story written in the language of molecules and pheromones. She could smell the mountains beyond 3 miles away, crisp and clean, and calling to something primal inside her. She could smell a deer far away, its scent sharp and musk sweet on the wind. In the first moment of freedom, the urge to hunt rose in her like a tide, and she had to consciously suppress it, had to remind herself that she was still in the citadel, still surrounded by people, still learning what it meant to be a wolf at all. Her paws were massive, larger than a human hand, with claws that could carve through stone if she pressed down hard enough. She flexed them experimentally against the floor and cracked spiderweb out from where her claws touched. The strength in her was staggering. She moved, and the movement was effortless, graceful, perfect, in a way that her human body could never achieve. This was what her body was meant to do. This was what it had been screaming to do for 22 years. She bounded toward the door of the healing wing, her silver fur flowing like liquid metal as she moved, and the healer pressed herself against the wall, not in fear exactly, but in awe. Leora burst through the doorway and into the corridors of Thornvale Citadel, and the shock of the other servants and guards was palpable. A massive silver wolf with fur that glowed with its own inner light was running through their fortress, and every instinct told them they should be afraid. But there was something in her bearing, something in the way she moved, that spoke of rightness rather than danger. She was supposed to be here. She was supposed to be free. Her hooves would have clicked on the stone, but her paws were silent, predator-light, and perfect. She flew through corridors that had confined her in human form, and every space seemed smaller now, less imprisoning. She burst into the courtyard, and the night air hit her like a revelation. The sky was full of stars, and she could see them with a clarity that human eyes could never achieve. The moon was rising, vast and luminous, and it called to something in her blood, something ancient and wild. She howled, not the same howl as in the healing wing, but a howl of pure joy, of freedom, of running for the first time in her life, with no chains, no restraints, no silver weight holding her down. Her paws struck the courtyard stones, and she was moving, really moving, faster than she'd ever moved in her life. Her muscles working in perfect coordination, her balance perfect, her heart singing with the exhilaration of it. She ran through the citadel gardens, and the scents were overwhelming. Flowers and herbs and growing things, each one a distinct note in a symphony of smell. She ran until her breath came hard and fast, and it felt good, felt right, felt like everything she'd been missing for her entire life. And then, from somewhere in the citadel, she felt his presence. The Alpha King, his wolf was emerging now, responding to her call, drawn to her like iron to magnetism. She turned and ran toward him, toward the bond that was forming between them, toward the future that was beginning to unfold. Their wolves met in the courtyard under the moonlight, silver and black, female and male, equals and partners, and something else neither of them had a name for yet. They ran together through the night, through the mountains, through the territories around Thornvale, and for the first time, she was not running from anything. She was running toward everything. She was running toward her life. The healer was crying. When she was finally able to speak, her voice shaking, she said only, "A silver wolf. There hasn't been one in 200 years. The prophecy." Her voice trailed off into wonder. "Tell me about the prophecy," the Alpha King said quietly, his own voice rough with emotion and the effort of his transformation. The healer spoke slowly, carefully, pieces of history dragged up from places they'd been buried deep, sealed away in scrolls and restricted texts. A silver wolf would be born who could not be controlled by any lock of metal or magic, who could not be intimidated by any show of force or fear. A silver wolf would have the power to break old structures, to overthrow the keepers of tradition, to shatter the hierarchies that had held the packs in place for centuries. A silver wolf was the future, made manifest in flesh and bone and wild magic. A silver wolf would change everything. 22 years ago, when Leora's parents had birthed a silver cub with eyes like green fire, the corrupt elder had been afraid, very afraid, terrified in fact, panicked, because he understood that the prophecy meant the end of his power, the end of his control, the end of the old ways that had served him so well. So he'd ordered the chains, ancient, illegal, blood magic binding them in place at birth, the locks sealed with the elder's own corrupted magic, sewn directly into her infant skin, while she screamed a newborn scream of pain. He'd lied to everyone who would listen, claiming the child was defective, wolfless, broken beyond repair. He'd assigned a handler to ensure the wolf never emerged, to beat it down if it tried, to keep it suppressed with violence and magic both. He'd buried the prophecy and the woman both in the labor house, in chains, in servitude, hoping that if he could just suppress her long enough, the prophecy would become invalid, the future would change, and he would remain in power. But the prophet, it turned out, couldn't be stopped by iron, or magic, or fear, or the best efforts of corrupt men. The consequences came swiftly. Within a day, the Alpha King had called an assembly of every noble, every warrior, every person with power in Thornvale and the surrounding territories. The corrupt elder was brought before the court, along with the handler who'd profited from the woman's imprisonment. The charges were read with formality: abuse of ancient forbidden magic, suppression of a citizen's natural form, human trafficking and exploitation, conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate heir of the prophecy, attempted genocide against the prophesied line. The elder tried to defend himself, his voice shaking with rage and desperation, his arguments becoming more frantic with each moment. He claimed the woman was dangerous, that she was a threat to everything they'd built, that she represented chaos and the end of order, that the prophecy had been written to justify chaos and overthrow, that the chains had been necessary for the stability of the realm, that he'd acted out of duty to protect his people, that every cruel decision had been made with the good of the Pax in mind. He spoke of the danger of unchecked power, of the need for structure and control, of how prophets and chosen ones had destroyed civilizations before. But the healer brought forth evidence, undeniable and overwhelming. The scars on Leora's wrists and ankles, meticulously documented, photographed, and witnessed. The historical records of the woman's confinement in the labor house, the registry of her handlers, the payment records showing how her labor had been sold, the magical surge that had been released when the locks broke, a surge powerful enough to be felt for miles around, recorded by every healer and sensitive in the region on that very day. The testimony of the other servants in the labor house brought forward and given voice, undeniable proof of what had been done, of the conspiracy, of the lies. The handler wept and begged for mercy, throwing himself on the floor, his voice breaking as he prostrated himself before the assembled court. He promised anything if only he could live, if only he could be forgiven, if only he could be given a second chance. He claimed he was just following orders, that he'd had no choice, that the elder had controlled him. He described the horror he felt at what he'd been made to do, the guilt that had haunted him. It was a pathetic display. The Alpha King watched him with eyes that had no mercy in them, eyes that had seen what had been done to a woman for 22 years, eyes that understood the price of such cruelty and the lie of remorse that came only when the perpetrator faced consequences. Kale's expression never changed. His judgment, when it came, was swift and absolute. When it was over, the elder, the man who had ordered the chains, who had written the lies that had been Leora's only truth for 22 years, was stripped of his titles and locked away in the deepest dungeons of the citadel, but not in chains of silver. Those had been deemed too cruel, too darkly magical, reserved only for the most dangerous enemies of the state. No, the elder's restraints were made of something else, a metal that burned his skin on contact, bindings created specifically to suppress magical ability, to render him powerless in the way he had tried to render Leora powerless. His own magic was bound, sealed away, locked behind barriers of blood magic that were designed to hold strong. The guards who led him away reported that, as they dragged him through the corridors, he wept like a child, understanding finally what it meant to have your nature imprisoned, to have your power suppressed, to be rendered less than yourself. He would spend the rest of his natural life locked in that dungeon, conscious and aware and powerless, a poetic reflection of what he had done to her. The handler's fate was different, but no less just. When the sentence came, Leora watched from where she stood beside the Alpha King. Vard, the man who had held the keys to her chains for so long, who had yanked her around by the silver links, who had profited from her suffering, was brought forward in chains, and not new chains. No, in a moment of perfect, terrible justice, they brought forth the very chains that had been removed from Leora's wrists and ankles, the 7 locks that had imprisoned her wolf. The handler's eyes went wide with horror and recognition as he understood what was about to happen. He screamed, he begged, he tried to run, but the guards were prepared, brutal in their efficiency. They wrapped the same chains around his body that he had wrapped around hers, and when the locks snapped shut, the magic responded. The chains recognized a new wearer, and they tightened, just as they had tightened when Leora tested them with hope or fear or exhaustion. Vard fell to his knees, gasping, understanding finally what he had forced upon her. And then, as his punishment, he was sent into exile, wearing those chains. Released from the citadel, given only enough supplies to reach the nearest village, told that if he ever showed his face in Thornvale territory again, he would be executed. He would wear the chains that had once held the silver wolf, and he would understand, with every ounce of his being, what he had taken from her. The chains would never release him. That magic, the healer had explained, only worked for the innocent ones, the ones being punished unjustly. For him, they would only tighten further, drawing his power inward, suppressing the best parts of himself, ensuring that he never knew freedom again. It was poetic. It was just. It was the kind of symmetry that made even the hardest warriors in the court nod in grim satisfaction. Justice came in a form that tasted like ashes and vindication braided together. It was not the kind of justice that felt good or satisfied. It was the kind of justice that acknowledged that what had been done could never be fully repaired, that no punishment could return to Leora the 22 years that had been stolen from her, the experiences she'd missed, the life she should have lived. But it was justice nonetheless. It was acknowledgement. It was accountability. It was a statement to the world that the weak would be protected, that the powerless would be heard, that even the mightiest would face consequences for their cruelty. In the aftermath, the woman had to learn to be human again. The wolf was still there now, always a thought away from shifting, a presence that was comforting rather than terrifying. It was like discovering a part of herself that had always belonged there, but had been hidden away. The integration between her human consciousness and her wolf consciousness was still new, still being negotiated. Sometimes she would be eating breakfast and suddenly taste something through a wolf's senses, smell a deer 2 miles away on the wind. Sometimes her hands would move with wolf grace, perfect and efficient in a way human muscles could never quite achieve. It was emerging, still in process, a becoming that would take time. Her body, for the first time in 22 years, belonged to her. She moved without the chain's interference, without the weight that had dictated her every step, and it felt like flying. She sat down to eat, actually sat in a chair at a table. and no one tried to tell her she wasn't allowed to rest. She slept in a real bed with clean linens that smelled like lavender and herbs, with pillows that supported her head, with a blanket heavy enough to feel like security rather than constraint. She wore clothes that didn't need to accommodate metal, that let her skin breathe, that allowed her to move freely. Small things that revealed themselves as miracles when you'd lived without them long enough. She showered in hot water, feeling the grime of the labor house wash away. She spent entire afternoons sitting in the Citadel's gardens, feeling the sun on her face, breathing air that wasn't recycled through stone corridors. The Alpha King called her to his study one evening. 3 weeks after the breaking of the chains, she came as a human, though the wolf was always present now, a warmth beneath her skin, a power that hummed in her bones. She wore a dress that didn't need to accommodate silver and chains, a dress of soft gray wool with silver threads woven through the fabric in patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the light. Someone, perhaps Esma the healer, perhaps one of the other servants, had chosen it carefully, knowing that the gray would complement her eyes, that the silver would honor what she'd become. Her hair, now that it could be properly cared for and not matted with sweat and dirt, fell in waves down her back, a color that shifted between copper and dark auburn, depending on how the light caught it. It was longer than she remembered it being in the labor house, as if her body was reclaiming the growth that had been suppressed for so long. The scars on her wrists had begun to fade, though they'd never fully disappear. Some markings were written too deep into the skin to ever be completely erased. They were part of her story now, part of the evidence of what she'd survived, part of her strength. She wore them with something close to pride. "What is your name?" he asked, not assuming she had one, understanding that names themselves had been one of the things taken from her, that she'd been denied even the basic acknowledgement of identity. She had to think. In the labor house, she'd been called you by her handler, it, or sometimes property. But there had been a time before the chains, a time when she'd been loved and named by people who understood her worth. The memory surfaced like something breaking through dark water, precious and fragile. "Leora," she said. "My name was Leora." "Leora," the Alpha King repeated, as if tasting the word on his tongue, as if the word itself held power. "I am Kyle, Alpha of Thornvale Citadel, and you, Leora, with eyes like green fire, are the most powerful wolf I have ever encountered. Not because I broke your chains, but because you survived them, because you kept yourself alive and real and waiting inside those locks for 2 decades. That strength no force in this world can contain." She didn't know what to say. She didn't know who she was yet, beyond the woman shaped by suffering and survival, but she could feel the wolf within her, content now, not screaming, present, real, hers, no longer fighting her for existence, but integrated, whole, complete. Kyle extended his hand, the one that had been bleeding to break her chains, now healed but still marked with silver scars across the palm. "Your strength deserves to be used for something meaningful. Will you stay? Will you learn to be free in this place? Will you let me know you as a partner rather than see you as someone to rescue?" She looked at his hand. She thought about the labor house and the chains and everything that had been taken from her. She thought about the cost of her freedom, written in the blood of a man she barely knew, but whose sacrifice had cracked her world open. She thought about the prophecy and the future, and the fact that she had no idea what came next. But for the first time, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than terror. She took his hand. His grip was strong, equal, not holding her captive. This was a hand that had freed her, not enslaved her. A hand that recognized her as his equal, not his responsibility. And maybe that was enough to start with. Maybe that was everything. Yes, she said. I'll stay. The next morning, she stood in the courtyard of Thornvale Citadel, with the sunrise painting the stone walls in shades of gold and amber. The sky was streaked with colors that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the normal spectrum, as if the world itself was celebrating her freedom. Around her, guards and servants paused in their morning tasks to watch as she let herself shift. The transformation came easily now, her body understanding the transitions, the human and wolf forms merging and separating like water flowing in different channels. The wolf emerged cleanly, smoothly, without chains, without suppression, without the agonizing pain that had characterized the first breaking. Her silver fur caught the morning light and seemed to glow with its own internal luminescence, as if she carried starlight within her body. She felt the mountain air in her fur, crisp and clean and alive with possibility. She felt the ancient magic of the citadel beneath her paws, woven into the very stones, welcoming her, acknowledging her, recognizing her as the fulfillment of prophecy. She felt, for the first time in 22 years, like she belonged to herself, like her body was her own, not borrowed, not loaned by people who could take it away. Like her nature was something to celebrate rather than suppress, something powerful and beautiful and undeniable. She threw back her silver head and howled, not in pain this time, but in joy, in gratitude, in the simple exuberance of being alive and free. And somewhere in the citadel, Kyle felt her presence through the pack bond that was forming between them. Not a bond of servitude or domination, but a bond of equals, recognizing each other across the distance between their forms. Two wolves, Alpha and Silver, finding their way into a future where neither would be bound by anything but choice. Neither would be enslaved by anything but commitment deliberately made, renewed every sunrise. He shifted into his own wolf form in the privacy of his chambers, a massive black wolf with amber eyes, and howled back to her across the stones. The sound of their joined voices echoed across Thornvale and beyond, a duet that spoke of recognition, of respect, of a partnership that would change the world. The chains lay forgotten in the healing wing, 7 locks, forever undone. They would be melted down eventually, the metal re-forgotten into the world as something new. Some said Kyle would have them forged into a crown for her, acknowledging what she had always been, a queen, a prophet, a force of nature that could not be chained. Some said the metal would be scattered to the 4 winds, that no lock could ever be made from it again. But the woman who had worn them, she was reborn. She was free. She was real. She was powerful beyond measure. She was herself for the first time in her life. She was Leora of the Silver Wolf. She was the prophecy made flesh. She was the future that could not be denied. And she was only just beginning. The chains were gone, but her true journey, the journey of learning who she was, of claiming her power, of discovering what a woman with a silver wolf inside her could become, that was just starting. Every morning would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new ways to be alive in a world that would have to change to accommodate her existence. Every moment would be a choice to reclaim what had been taken, to build something new, to prove that prophecy and power could not be suppressed by fear or magic or chains. The story of Leora of the Silver Wolf had only just begun to unfold, and the world was watching, waiting to see what she would become.